Poor Waitress answers a late-night call, unaware the boy's father is a ruthless Italian mafia boss. A lonely Waitress forms a deep phone connection with a frightened boy, only to discover he's the son of a mafia boss. When she is forced to go to him, she doesn't become a victim, but the catalyst for a bloody family revolution, uncovering a secret that makes her the most dangerous person in the room. The world for Isabella had shrunk to the dimensions of a Formica countertop and the slow, syrupy drip of the coffee machine. The last stop diner was a relic, a bubble of faded chrome and neon adrift in the 2 a.m. silence of the city. Outside, the world was a blur of occasional headlights and deepening shadows. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of fried onions and lonely conversations. She moved through the familiar motions, her cloth wiping a damp trail across the laminate, chasing crumbs that were more memory than substance. The trucker in booth 3, a regular named Frank with kind eyes and a wedding ring he polished when he thought no one was looking, had just left. The bell above the door had chimed his exit, leaving behind the scent of diesel and the weight of the quiet. This was the hour she both dreaded and cherished. The silence was a blanket, but it was also an echo chamber. It was in these hours that the memory of her own loss felt loudest, the art school dreams packed away in a storage unit, the family that was now just a collection of old photographs. The diner was her sanctuary and her purgatory. The phone's ring was a shriek in the stillness, a jangling metal bell that made her jump. She wiped her hands on her apron, the word Florence, stitched in fading red thread over her heart, and picked up the heavy receiver. "The last stop," she said, her voice the standard, weary-friendly tone she reserved for the late-night crazies and insomniacs. "We're open till 4. What can I get you?" There was a pause, filled only with the pristine hollow sound of a high-quality line. Then a small voice, so quiet she had to press the receiver hard against her ear. Is this the place with the star pancakes?" Was a child. A boy. His voice was like glass, delicate and on the verge of cracking. A genuine, soft smile touched Isabella's lips for the first time all shift. "Yeah, it is. We put a chocolate chip on each point. You calling for a late-night snack?" She leaned against the counter, picturing a kid who'd snuck the menu to bed. "No," the word was barely a whisper. I like the picture on the menu. It looks happy." Isabella's smile softened. She knew the picture he meant, a garishly bright photo of a stack of pancakes, a grinning star of whipped cream beaming up from the plate. It was tacky, the kind of thing she'd rolled her eyes at when she started. But now she saw it through his eyes. A promise of simple, uncomplicated joy. "It can be a happy place," she said, her voice dropping into a more intimate register. This wasn't a customer. This was a kid reaching out in the dark. "My name's Isabella. What's yours?" The silence stretched. She could hear him breathing, a soft, hesitant rhythm. She was about to think he'd hung up when he finally spoke. "Leo. Well, Leo. It's a little late for you to be up, isn't it?" She tried to keep her tone light, but a thread of concern wove through it. The line was too clear, too quiet. There was no background noise of a TV or family. Just a profound, expensive silence. "I'm not tired," he insisted, but his voice was thick with exhaustion that went beyond the physical. It was the tiredness of someone who had been alone for too long. And so it began. The next night at 2:17 a.m. the phone rang again. And the night after that. It became their secret ritual, a stolen hour carved out of the sleeping world. Isabella found herself looking forward to it, her cleaning done with more purpose, a fresh pot of coffee brewing just for her. Their conversations were a mosaic of a life she could only piece together. He was smart, frighteningly so for an 8-year-old, with a vocabulary that spoke of private tutors and a world contained within walls. He talked about his model ships, intricate, historical things his Uncle Carlo bought him. "He says they'll teach me patience," Leo said once, and Isabella heard the unspoken subtext. "They'll keep me in my room." He never mentioned friends. He talked about his father with a mixture of awe and fear. "He's important. He's always working. He has meetings." The way he said meetings made it sound like a storm cloud. Isabella listened, truly listened. She was an expert in the language of loneliness. She heard what he didn't say, the spacious house that felt empty, the father who was a ghost, the uncle who was a jailer in the guise of a gift giver. She offered him the one thing she had in abundance, a patient, non-judgmental ear. She became his anchor in the vast, quiet sea of his life. Then one night the call was different. The rain was sheeting down outside, painting the diner's windows in rivulets of distorted light. When the phone rang she knew it was him, but the rhythm was wrong, frantic. "Isabella?" His voice was a choked sob. "Are you there?" Her grip tightened on the receiver, her knuckles turning white. "I'm here, Leo. I'm right here. What's wrong?" "I had a bad dream." He was crying in earnest now, trying to stifle the sounds. "A really bad one. But I heard a loud noise. From Papa's study. It didn't sound like a dream. It sounded like something broke." A cold dread, sharp and immediate, trickled down Isabella's spine. This wasn't a child's nightmare. This was real fear. "Where's your dad now, honey?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay calm. "He's gone. He's always gone when it gets loud. It's just me and the men outside the door." The men outside the door. The phrase painted a terrifying picture. This wasn't just a lonely child. This was a frightened one living in a fortress. In that moment, Isabella's own loneliness, her own safe, miserable routine, shattered. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a lifeline. "Leo, listen to me," she said, her voice low and urgent. She grabbed a pen and an old order pad. "I get off at 4 a.m. I'm going to give you my personal number. It's my cell phone. You can carry it with you. If you're ever really, really scared, you call me. Okay. Anytime. Day or night." She recited the number slowly, clearly, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was crossing a line. This was stupid. This was human. He repeated it back to her, his small voice firming with each digit, memorizing the sequence like a spell of protection. "Good," she whispered. "Now try to be brave. I'm right here." She hung up the phone, the silence of the diner now feeling menacing. She looked out at the rain-lashed night, no longer seeing a city but a maze. And somewhere in that maze, a little boy was holding on to her number like a shield, unaware that the simple act of offering it had just pulled her into his dark, dangerous world. The rain had become a permanent state of being. It wasn't falling so much as it was suspended in the air, a fine misty curtain that blurred the line between sky and earth. In her small, boxed-in apartment, Isabella felt the dampness seep into her bones. The call had ended over an hour ago, but the ghost of Leo's sobs still echoed in the silence, a relentless, haunting refrain. She paced the worn floorboards, the single lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her helplessness. The digital clock on the microwave glowed 3:22 a.m. Every logical cell in her body screamed at her to stay put. "He's just a scared kid. It was a bad dream. You're overreacting. This is none of your business." But the memory of his voice, the raw, animal terror in it, overrode the logic. It didn't sound like a dream. And then the crash. The roar of a man's voice, a sound of pure, unfiltered rage. The deadline. She'd redialed his number a dozen times. Each time, it rang into a void, the sterile tone of verdict of failure. She'd even called the diner's number, the one he always called from, letting it ring 20-30 times, imagining the sound echoing through the empty, dark restaurant, bouncing off the vinyl booths and the picture of the star pancakes. Helplessness was a taste, metallic and sour, in the back of her throat. It was the same feeling she'd had in the hospital waiting room years ago, a feeling of being a spectator to a tragedy barreling down a track she couldn't alter. Then her eyes fell on a small, cluttered shelf by the door. Tucked between a stack of mail and a set of keys was an old pay stub from the last stop, folded and faded. Months ago, in a moment of childish pride, Leo had recited his address to her. "It's on Hunter's Crest Lane," he'd said, his voice puffing up. "You should see the house, Isabella. It's like a castle. You could get lost in it." At the time she just smiled, humoring him. Now, with a trembling hand, she smoothed the crumpled pay stub and wrote the address in the margin, 17 Hunter's Crest Lane. The ink bled slightly on the cheap paper. This was the line. The one she could never uncross. Going to him wasn't just checking on a friend, it was barging into a world that had clearly built high walls for a reason. But the image of him, small and alone in that castle, was the only thing that mattered. Her beat-up sedan coughed to life, the engine protesting the late-hour damp. The drive to Hunter's Crest was a journey into another city, one she'd only ever seen in magazines. The cramped downtown streets gave way to wide, tree-lined boulevards, which then twisted into secluded, winding roads that clung to the hillside. The homes grew farther apart, hidden behind high hedges and imposing gates, their windows dark and judgmental. She found number 17. It wasn't a castle, it was a fortress. A high wall of aged stone, topped with black iron spikes that looked less decorative and more functional, stretched into the darkness. The main gate was a masterpiece of wrought iron, intricate and forbidding. Through the bars she could see a long manicured driveway leading to a monstrously large Italianate villa, its windows mostly dark, save for a single glowing eye on the second floor, Leo's room, she hoped. She parked 100 yards down the road, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The rain misted her windshield, distorting the view. This is insane. Turn back. Call the police. But what would she say? A boy I talked to on the phone sounded scared? They'd laugh at her. Driven by a compulsion she couldn't name, she got out of the car. The air up here was different, colder, thinner, scented of wet earth and money. She approached the gate on foot, her sneakers silent on the damp asphalt. As she reached for the intercom button, two figures detached themselves from the shadows beside the gateposts. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace that froze the blood in her veins. They weren't security guards in cheap uniforms. They were men in impeccably tailored suits, their coats dark and dry despite the rain. Their faces were impassive, carved from stone. The one on the right placed himself between her and the intercom. "This is private property," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. A statement of fact, not a warning. It was more terrifying than a threat. Isabella's mouth went dry. I need to see Leo. Is he okay? I have a friend." The man's eyes, cold and assessing, scanned her from her damp hair to her worn-out sneakers. He saw everything, her cheap coat, her trembling hands, her absolute insignificance. "He has no friends," the man stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Before she could form a response, the massive front door of the villa opened, casting a long jaundiced slab of light onto the driveway. A man stood silhouetted in the frame. Even at this distance, his presence was a physical weight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and stood with an unnerving stillness. "Who is this?" The voice that carried down the drive was calm, low, and laced with an accent that curled around the words like smoke. It was the voice from the phone, the one that had roared before the line went dead. The guard turned slightly. "She says she's a friend of the boy, Don Rossi." The man in the doorway, Luca Rossi, stepped forward into the light. The rain didn't seem to dare touch him. He was in his 40s, with sharp, aristocratic features that would have been handsome if they weren't so utterly devoid of warmth. His hair was jet black, swept back, and his eyes, even from this distance, looked like chips of obsidian. His gaze swept over her, and Isabella felt utterly transparent. He saw a problem. A minor one. A piece of lint on his otherwise immaculate world. "Bring her inside," he said, the command quiet, absolute. The gate buzzed and swung open with a heavy, metallic groan. The journey up the driveway felt like a walk to the gallows. The two men flanked her, not touching her, but their presence was a cage. The front door loomed, a dark mouth ready to swallow her whole. She was led into a foyer that was larger than her entire apartment building. A crystal chandelier hung like a frozen waterfall overhead, its light glinting off marble floors and dark oiled wood. The air smelled of lemon polish and something else, something old and powerful. They didn't stop in the foyer. They ushered her into a study. It was a room of terrifying elegance. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held leather-bound volumes that looked never touched. A massive desk, bare except for a single, sleek laptop, stood like an altar. And in front of a stone fireplace large enough to park a car in, stood Luca Rossi. He turned to face her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored trousers. He was examining her the way a biologist might examine a strange, new insect. "You have 5 seconds to explain why you are at my home before you disappear," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Start with how you know my son." Isabella's knees felt weak. She locked them, forcing herself to stand straight. Her waitress instincts kicked in, the need to appear calm under pressure, to de-escalate. "He calls me. At the diner where I work. The last stop." Her voice trembled, but she pushed the words out. "He was scared tonight. He called me and I heard a fight and the line went dead. I was worried." Luca's expression didn't change, but a tiny muscle in his jaw feathered. A crack in the marble facade. "The waitress," he said as if recalling a minor footnote. "He talks about you. The star pancakes." He took a step closer and the room seemed to shrink. "You listen to me. You will forget this address. You will forget my son's name. You will go back to your life. If you speak of this to anyone, I will know. And it will be the last thing you do." It was the cold, casual certainty in his tone that was most chilling. He wasn't threatening her. He was stating a simple, inevitable outcome. But his threat sparked a sudden, defiant heat in her chest. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a person he was trying to erase. "Is he safe?" she demanded, her voice gaining a shred of strength. "Just tell me that." The study door, which had been left ajar, creaked open. Leo stood there, small and pale in his blue pajamas. His eyes were wide, red-rimmed from crying, and they darted from his father's imposing back to Isabella's face. A spark of pure, unadulterated relief lit his features. Isabella? He didn't hesitate. He darted past his father, a tiny ship navigating a dangerous shore, and wrapped his arms tightly around her waist, burying his face in her damp coat. Isabella's arms came around him instinctively, holding him close. She looked over his head, meeting Luca Rossi's gaze. Her own eyes were no longer pleading. They were hard, defiant. In that moment, the power in the room had subtly, irrevocably shifted. The wolf had made a threat, but the boy had chosen his protector. And the ruthless mafia boss was now staring at the one thing his money and power couldn't buy, and the one thing his son desperately needed: a genuine human connection. The silence in the study after Leo's embrace was more deafening than any shout. Isabella could feel the boy's small heart hammering against her, a frantic bird trapped against her ribs. She kept her arms around him, a human shield against the glacial stare of his father. Luca Rossi's face was an unreadable mask, but his eyes, those obsidian chips, flickered with a rapid internal calculation. The equation had changed. The variable of his son's absolute, unhesitating trust had been introduced, and it was one his cold calculus couldn't immediately solve. After a long moment, Luca's voice cut through the tension, not to her, but to the boy. Leo. To your room. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command from a world where commands were never questioned. Leo flinched, his grip tightening on Isabella's coat. "It's okay, Leo," she murmured into his hair, her voice soft but clear, a deliberate counterpoint to his father's steel. "Go on. I'll be right here." The promise felt like a lie even as she said it, but it was enough. He slowly let go, his eyes wide with a plea she couldn't possibly answer, and shuffled out of the study, one of the stone-faced guards closing the door behind him with a soft, definitive click. The lock of the door echoed in the vast room. Isabella was alone with the wolf. He didn't speak at first. He walked to his desk, poured a finger of amber liquid from a crystal decanter into a tumbler, and took a slow, deliberate sip. He was performing calmness, and the performance was more terrifying than any outburst. "My brother Carlo," he began, his back to her, "has overstepped. He questions my leadership. He uses my grief, my distraction, against me." He turned, his eyes pinning her. "He believes my focus is fractured. That my heart has made me weak." Isabella's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. The fight Leo overheard. The mention of his mother. A power struggle. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "My son trusts you," Luca stated, as if this were a bizarre and inconvenient natural phenomenon. "In my world, trust is a currency rarer than loyalty and far more dangerous. It cannot be bought. It cannot be enforced. He gives it to you freely." He set the tumbler down with a quiet, precise tap. "That makes you an asset. And a vulnerability." He walked toward her, not with menace, but with the air of a CEO outlining a hostile takeover. "You will stay. You will be his companion. His tutor. You will ensure he feels safe and, more importantly, that he remains quiet. He speaks to you. I need him to continue speaking. To you and only to you." The audacity of it stole her breath. "You're kidnapping me?" The word sounded melodramatic, absurd, yet it was the only one that fit. "I'm employing you," he corrected, his tone utterly devoid of irony. "A significant salary will be deposited for you. Anonymously. In return, you do not leave this property. You do not contact anyone from your previous life. Your sole function is to care for my son and to be the receptacle for his confidences." He picked up a folded newspaper from the corner of his desk. Isabella hadn't noticed it before. He slid it across the polished wood toward her. "Your old life," he said, his voice flat, "is no longer a concern." Her hands trembled as she reached for it. It was today's paper. The city edition. Her eyes scanned the front page and the bottom fell out of her world. There was a photo of the Last Stop diner, cordoned off with yellow police tape. The front window was a blackened, gaping maw. The headline was stark and brutal: "Diner fire ruled arson, owner missing." The words swam before her eyes. Arson. Missing. Frank, the kind-eyed trucker? Martha, the gruff but big-hearted cook? Her throat constricted. She thought of her apron, the one with Florence stitched on it, probably ash now. "A tragedy," Luca said, his voice cutting through her spiraling horror. "But a convenient one. It severs your ties. Makes you a ghost. No one will come looking for a waitress who vanished after her workplace mysteriously burned down." He had erased her. With a phone call, a command, he had vaporized her entire existence. Her job, her home, her meager history, all gone, transformed into a cautionary tale in a newspaper. The salary he offered wasn't payment, it was hush money, a monument to her own disappearance. Isabella looked from the newspaper to his impassive face. The cold, brutal efficiency of it was staggering. This wasn't just power, it was a godlike ability to reshape reality itself. "Your old life is gone, Isabella?" he repeated, the finality in his tone as hard as the marble beneath her feet. "This is your new one." He gestured to the door where the guard stood waiting. She was no longer a guest or even a prisoner. She was a piece on his chessboard, moved to a new square. Numb, her mind reeling with the sheer scale of the nightmare, she allowed herself to be led out of the study. As the door closed behind her, she caught one last glimpse of Luca Rossi. He had turned back to the fireplace, the glass in his hand, a solitary king in a castle built on blood and lies. And she was now trapped inside the walls, a ghost in a gilded cage, her only purpose to soothe the heir to a throne she wanted no part of. The game had begun and she hadn't even known she was a player. The gilded cage, Isabella quickly learned, operated on a schedule as precise and unyielding as a Swiss watch. Her days were no longer measured by the ebb and flow of diner customers, but by the silent, invisible machinery of the Rossi household. Her world was now a series of opulent rooms, the sun-drenched morning room where she and Leo tackled mathematics and history, the vast, echoing library where they read adventure stories, their voices small against the towering shelves, the cavernous kitchen where she taught him how to make simple pasta, a mundane act that felt like a rebellion in this temple of hired help. Luca had provided her with a new wardrobe, simple, expensive clothes that felt like a costume. She was playing a part, the companion, the tutor, the keeper of the boy's morale. Leo blossomed under her attention. The fearful, hushed child began to laugh, his voice echoing in halls that had known only whispers and threats. He clung to her, a lifeline in a sea of cold marble and colder faces. Isabella, in turn, poured all her fractured affection into him. He was the only thing in this nightmare that felt real. But the darkness of the house was a living thing. It resided in the armed men who stood at every exterior door, their eyes scanning the manicured grounds with a perpetual professional suspicion. It was in the staff, the cook, the maid, the groundskeeper, who moved like ghosts, their eyes downcast, their answers to her polite questions brief and carefully neutral. They were loyal to the master of the house, and she was a temporary, perplexing anomaly. And it was in Luca himself. He was a distant planet in their small solar system, his gravity felt but his presence rare. He would sometimes join them for dinner in the formal dining room, a long, bleak expanse of polished table where the clink of silverware was deafening. He would ask Leo about his lessons, his tone formal, almost clinical. But Isabella saw the way his eyes lingered on his son, the fleeting, unguarded flicker of love and anguish before the shutters of control came down. She saw the way he never truly relaxed, his body always poised, listening for a threat only he could hear. It was during one of these strained meals that Carlo came to dinner. He was a distorted mirror image of his brother, the same sharp bone structure, but where Luca's severity was controlled, Carlo's was loose, predatory. He had a smile that showed too many teeth and didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. Well, the famous waitress," he'd said, his gaze crawling over her as he took his seat. "Leo hasn't stopped chattering about you. It's good he has a new distraction. After his mother, well." He let the sentence hang, a deliberate poison in the air. Luca's knuckles, resting on the table, went white. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Carlo," Luca said, the single word a warning and a threat. "Just making conversation, brother," Carlo said, helping himself to wine. "It's good to see the boy happy. Makes the house feel less empty." His eyes met Isabella's again and the message was clear. "You are a temporary fixture. A piece of furniture." After that, Isabella watched Carlo closely. She saw the subtle disrespect in the way he spoke to Luca, the veiled challenges masked as concern. She saw the way the guards loyal to him, a different set, she noted with harder eyes, would nod to him with a deference that bordered on devotion. The house was not a united front. It was a kingdom on the brink of civil war, and she and Leo were living in the demilitarized zone. The key, she felt, the thing that could explain the venom between the brothers, was Sophia. Leo's mother was a ghost that haunted every corridor. Her portrait hung in the main hall, a beautiful woman with Leo's intelligent, kind eyes and a smile that seemed to hold a secret. Isabella found herself drawn to it, feeling a strange kinship with this woman she'd never met. One rainy afternoon, while Leo was engrossed in painting, Isabella wandered the library. It was a room that felt more lived in than the others, the leather of the armchair slightly worn. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, a random collection of histories, philosophies, and classic literature. Then, tucked away in a corner behind a set of dense economic texts, her fingers brushed against a different kind of binding. Softer. Older. She pulled it out. It was a leather-bound journal, the cover embossed with a delicate pattern of climbing ivy. There was no name, but she knew. This was Sophia's. Her heart hammered with a guilty thrill. She glanced toward the door, then slipped into a deep armchair, the journal cradled in her lap. The pages were filled with elegant, looping script. It was not a diary of daily events, but a record of a soul. There were pressed flowers, their colors faded to ghosts of themselves. There were sketches of plants from the garden. And there were observations, sharp and worried. Luca is changing. The business hardens him. He carries the weight of it on his shoulders, and I fear it is crushing the man I fell in love with. The wolf is a persona he puts on, but I worry the costume is becoming the man. Carlo whispers in his ear, feeding his paranoia, encouraging his worst instincts. He fans the flames of Luca's anger and calls it strength. My husband does not see the snake he welcomes into our home. Isabella's breath caught. Her fingers trembled as she turned the page. I can no longer stand by. I started my own record. A private ledger. Not of money but of truths. Dates. Names. The flow of money Carlo tries to hide. The meetings with the Barone family that Luca knows nothing of. Something happens to me someone must know. For Luca. For my Leo. The ledger. The thing they had fought about the night her world collapsed. Isabella closed the journal, holding it as if it were a live explosive. Sophia hadn't just been a grieving wife. She had been a spy in her own home, documenting her brother-in-law's treachery. She had seen the cancer and had tried to document it before it consumed them all. And then she was gone. The unspoken question hung in the air. Had something happened to her? That night, unable to sleep, Isabella crept from her room. The mansion was a tomb, silent and cold. As she passed Luca's study, she heard the low rumble of voices. Carlo was there. Nervous Luca. Carlo's voice was a sharp hiss. They say you've gone soft since Sophia. And now you keep this nobody in our home? Is she your new whore? A replacement for a wife you couldn't protect. Isabella froze, her blood turning to ice. The sound that came from Luca was not a word, but a low, animal growl. You will not speak her name. You will not speak of Sophia. I'm trying to save what we built. Carlo shot back, his voice rising. You're losing your edge. The shipment tomorrow, it's a perfect opportunity for our rivals. I'm telling you there's a leak. It has to be someone close. Isabella didn't wait to hear more. She retreated into the shadows, her mind racing, Sophia's journal burning a hole in her memory. Carlo wasn't just questioning Luca. He was setting the stage. The leak was him. The someone close he would inevitably point to would be her. The outsider. The waitress. The perfect patsy to take the fall for his betrayal while he seized power. She stood in the dark hallway, the ghost of a dead woman's words in her mind and the venom of a living traitor in her ears. She was no longer just a pawn. She was a player who had just been handed the queen. The question was, did she have the courage to move it? The journal was a ghost in the room with her. For 2 days, Isabella carried Sophia's words in her mind, their weight a constant pressure behind her eyes. She moved through her duties with Leo on autopilot, her smiles feeling like cracks in a fragile veneer. Every time she looked at Luca, she saw the man Sophia had described, the man being consumed by the wolf, manipulated by the brother he still inexplicably trusted. Every time she saw Carlo's smug, calculating face, she saw the snake coiling itself around the foundations of the house, preparing to strike. The key was the ledger. Sophia's record of truths. It was the weapon that could prove Carlo's treachery. But where was it? The journal itself was a dead end. Its final entry was a lament, not a location. Sophia would never have kept something so dangerous in an obvious place. It had to be hidden somewhere personal, somewhere only she would have thought to look. Her thoughts kept returning to Leo. Sophia's greatest love. Her final thought had been for him. Would she have hidden it near him? The idea was terrifying. To involve him directly felt like a violation of the trust they'd built. But the alternative, allowing Carlo's plan to unfold, becoming his scapegoat and leaving Leo alone with a usurper, was unthinkable. The opportunity came on a quiet afternoon. Sunlight streamed into Leo's room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He was at his small desk, painstakingly adding color to a painting of a night sky, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. On his bedside table, next to a glass of water, was the beautiful mosaic-framed photograph of his mother. Isabella's heart began to thud a slow, heavy rhythm. She walked over casually, picking up the frame as if to admire it. She loved the stars, didn't she? Isabella said, her voice soft. Leo looked up, his eyes brightening. Yeah. She knew all the constellations. She said they were maps for people who felt lost. He pointed a paint-stained finger at the mosaic. She made this frame. See, that's Orion. And there's the Little Dipper. Isabella turned the frame over in her hands. It was heavy, the back sealed with a thin piece of wood. The mosaic on the front was intricate, thousands of tiny, colored tiles forming the celestial patterns. It was a labor of love. And then she saw it. In the bottom corner, near the base of the frame, the pattern was slightly off. The tiles were the same colors, but the constellation was wrong, a meaningless scatter of stars. The grout there looked newer, less settled. Her breath hitched. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Leo, she whispered, her throat tight. She ran her thumb over the anomalous section. It felt different. Slightly raised. Can I take a closer look at how she did this? She asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. The craftsmanship is amazing. Leo, proud of his mother's work, nodded eagerly. Sure. With painstaking slowness, Isabella carried the frame to the window, turning it so the light hit the flawed section. Using the nail of her thumb, she pressed gently against the edge of one of the tiles. It gave just a fraction. Her pulse roared in her ears. She glanced at Leo. He was back to his painting, humming softly. Working with the patience of a bomb disposal expert, she worried at the tile, her nail finding a minuscule purchase. After a minute that felt like an hour, the small, square tile popped loose into her palm. Behind it was not wood, but a dark, hollow space. She peered inside. There, nestled in the void, was a small, black, encrypted USB drive. Sophia's ledger. For a moment, Isabella just stared at it, this tiny sliver of silicon that held the power of life and death. This was the truth that had gotten a woman killed. And she was now holding it. Carefully, she slotted the tile back into place, the pattern restored to its beautiful, deceptive hole. She placed the frame back on the bedside table, the USB drive a burning secret in her clenched fist. She had the weapon. Now she had to decide how to wield it. That night, the mansion felt like it was holding its breath. The air was thick with impending violence. Luca had been sequestered in his study all evening, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke on the phone a constant, grim soundtrack. Isabella knew the shipment Carlo had mentioned was happening. The trap was being set. She waited until the deep night silence had fallen. Slipping from her room, she moved like a wisp through the dark halls, the USB drive a cold, hard talisman in her hand. She didn't knock on the study door. She simply opened it and walked in. Luca was standing before the fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the flames as if reading his future in the coals. He didn't turn, but his posture stiffened. I did not summon you, he said, his voice gravelly with exhaustion and tension. No, you didn't. He turned then, his eyes sweeping over her. He saw the determination on her face, the lack of fear. He saw the object in her outstretched hand. What is this? Your wife hid this, Isabella said, her voice clear and steady in the vast room. In Leo's room. In the frame of her picture. The mention of Sophia and Leo in the same breath as this clandestine object made his mask of control fracture. A raw, bewildered pain flashed across his features. What is it? He repeated, his voice softer. It's her ledger. The one you and Carlo were fighting about. It's not a financial record. It's a record of his betrayals. Carlo is the leak. He's been siphoning money, making deals with the Barone family. He was the one who had my diner burned down to isolate me, to make me the perfect patsy. He's framing you for the failure of the shipment tonight. This, she said, placing the drive on his desk with a definitive click, proves it. Luca stared at the drive as if it were a venomous serpent. He looked from it to Isabella, his mind visibly reeling, connecting the dots she had laid out for him. The sheer, impossible audacity of it. This waitress, this pawn he had plucked from obscurity, had walked into the heart of his home and uncovered the rot that was killing it from within. How did you? The question was half-whispered, stripped of its usual authority. I pay attention, she said, her gaze unwavering. It's what waitresses do. We see the details people in power think don't matter. We hear the things they think we're too stupid to understand. Your wife knew Carlo was a snake. She documented it. Now you know it too. For a long moment they just looked at each other. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shattered. She was no longer just his son's keeper. She was the bearer of a truth that could save or destroy him. He looked at her not as a nuisance or a tool but as an equal, a strategist, an ally. The wolf was gone. In his place was a man staring at the evidence of his own blindness, and the woman who had handed him a chance at redemption. His eyes hardened, the calculation returning, but it was a new kind. It was focused, lethal, and directed outward. "What do you suggest?" Luca Rossi asked, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. Isabella didn't hesitate. "Let him think his plan is working. But we turn the trap on him." The air on the docks was a foul cocktail of brine, diesel, and imminent rain. A heavy, wet wind whipped in from the sea, tugging at coats and snatching at words. From their vantage point in a derelict warehouse loft, the scene below was a stark diorama of shadows and tension. Luca's men, a handful of figures huddled near a stack of containers, looked like sheep waiting for a wolf they knew was coming. Isabella stood beside Luca, the rough wood of the windowsill digging into her palms. She was dressed in dark, borrowed clothes that felt alien against her skin. The encrypted files from Sophia's drive had been decrypted, the evidence laid bare. Dates, account numbers, transcripts of calls between Carlo and Emilio Barone, the head of the rival family. The betrayal was comprehensive, cold, and personal. Luca was a statue of contained violence beside her. He hadn't spoken in 20 minutes, his entire being focused through the high-powered binoculars. Two of his most trusted men vetted against the records in the ledger, flanked them, their presence a silent promise of protection. "He's here," Luca murmured, his voice a low vibration in the dark. Isabella followed his gaze. Carlo's figure emerged from behind a crane, pacing with a nervous energy that looked like concern to the untrained eye. But Isabella saw the telltale signs, the constant, furtive glances toward the southern gate, the way he kept patting his chest as if reassuring himself something was still there. A gun. Or a signal. "He's checking his watch," she whispered, the words tasting of metal. "He's waiting for them." Luca didn't acknowledge her, but she felt his attention sharpen. The trust was there, a fragile, newborn thing forged in the fire of his wife's secret ledger. Down below, a truck rumbled onto the dock, its headlights cutting swathes through the gloom. Luca's men stirred, moving to unload. This was the moment. The bait was in the water. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The only sounds were the creak of the ship at the berth and the distant moan of a foghorn. Then, as if a switch had been thrown, the world exploded. A fleet of black SUVs, their lights off, screeched through the southern gate, disgorging a small army of men armed with rifles. Gunfire erupted, sharp and deafening, echoing off the steel containers. Luca's men, following their orders, scattered, firing back but giving ground, making the ambush look successful. Isabella's heart seized. It was one thing to plan this, another to see the brutal reality of it. Men fell, their cries swallowed by the staccato gunfire. And there was Carlo. In the chaos, his nervous energy vanished, replaced by a grim, triumphant efficiency. He pulled his gun, but instead of aiming at the invading Barone men, he turned it on one of Luca's retreating soldiers. The betrayal was now physical, absolute. "Now," Luca said, the word quiet, final. He lifted a small radio to his lips. "Adesso." The word was a key turning a lock. From the rooftops of adjacent warehouses, from the decks of silent ships, Luca's true force revealed itself. Silhouettes rose against the bruised night sky. The muzzle flashes from their superior positions were like a sudden, deadly constellation. The Barone men, caught in the killing zone of the open dock, were cut down. The trap had been sprung on the trappers. The scene descended into a new, more calculated kind of hell. Carlo stood frozen in the middle of the carnage, his plan unraveling in a hail of his allies' blood. He looked around, wild-eyed, understanding dawning, and with it, terror. He tried to run, to melt into the shadows, but two of Luca's men materialized, grabbing him, disarming him with brutal efficiency, and dragging him toward the warehouse. Scene 2. Warehouse, continuous. The air in the warehouse was thick with dust and the smell of old fish and oil. A single bare bulb hung from a wire, casting a wobbly pool of jaundiced light onto the concrete floor. Carlo was thrown to his knees in the center of it. He was breathing in ragged, panicked gulps, his fine suit now torn and smudged with grime. The door creaked open and Luca entered, Isabella a half-step behind him. She willed her legs not to shake, her face to remain a neutral mask. This was the final act. Carlo's eyes, wide with fury and fear, darted from his brother's impassive face to Isabella's. The sight of her, standing at Luca's side as an equal, seemed to enrage him more than his own capture. "You?" He spat, the word a venomous curse. Her? A waitress, Luca? She's your solution? This is what you replace your brother with. Luca didn't answer. He simply stared, his silence more terrifying than any roar. Carlo sneered, a desperate, ugly expression. She's a loose end. They all are. You think this changes anything? You're still the man who got his wife killed. You're still soft. Luca's gaze flickered to Isabella, a silent, unreadable question. This was her moment. The final test of her mettle. Would she flinch? Would she show the mercy that Carlo equated with weakness? Isabella took a slow, deliberate step forward. She didn't look at Luca for permission. She walked until she was standing over Carlo, her shadow falling across his kneeling form. He looked up, his face a grotesque mask of hatred and pleading. She didn't speak to him of business or betrayal. She spoke to the core of his sin. You tried to use me, she said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the dusty air. You tried to use a little boy's fear. You don't deserve the family you were born into. Then, with a contempt that was more powerful than any physical blow, she turned her back on him. It was a gesture of supreme dismissal. His words, his existence meant nothing to her. She walked back to stand beside Luca, not as a subordinate, but as a partner who had delivered the verdict. The execution was not her domain. Luca watched her, and in his eyes she saw the last vestige of the wolf give way to something else, a grim, absolute respect. He had his answer. He raised his gun, the metal glinting coldly in the weak light. Carlo's bravado shattered. Luca. Brother, wait. We can fix this. It was for the family. For our future. Luca's voice was calm, horribly so. It was the voice of a man reading an epitaph he had already written. You threatened my son, he said, each word a nail in a coffin. You betrayed your blood. You disrespected my wife's memory. The three charges hung in the air, undeniable, unforgivable. Carlo opened his mouth to scream, to beg, to curse. The gunshot was a single deafening crack that swallowed all other sound. It echoed once, twice, against the metal walls, and then was swallowed by the sea wind and the distant, fading gunfire from the dock. Isabella didn't flinch. She held Luca's gaze, her own breath held tight in her chest. The world had shifted. The balance of power had been irrevocably sealed. Not just with a bullet, but with the truth she had unearthed and the spine she had shown. The waitress was gone. In her place stood a woman who had stared into the heart of the darkness, and had not blinked. A week after the storm on the docks, a strange, fragile peace had settled over the Rossi mansion. The air itself felt lighter, as if a poison had been purged from its veins. The guards who remained were the ones whose names were clean in Sophia's ledger, and their loyalty to Luca was now absolute, tempered in the fire of Carlo's betrayal. The silence was no longer threatening, but contemplative. Isabella stood in the study, the room where her nightmare had begun. Her small suitcase, another of Luca's provided amenities, sat packed and ready by the door. She was no longer the frightened woman in a damp coat. She stood straight, her gaze clear, having been tempered in the same fire as the men outside. Luca entered. He too was different. The perpetual tension in his shoulders had eased just a fraction. The ghost of his brother no longer whispered in his ear, but the weight of having executed him was a new, permanent burden in his eyes. You don't have to go, he said. The words were not a command nor a plea but a simple, stark offering. The salary remains. You are and will always be under my protection. This house, it is safer now. Isabella looked around the opulent room, the tomb of her old life, the crucible of her new one. She thought of Leo's laughter in the halls, a sound that had truly for the first time found a home here. I can't live in a cage, Luca. Even a gilded one. She met his gaze, her voice soft but unyielding. And Leo doesn't need a prisoner for a friend. He needs to see that there's a world outside these walls. A world where choices exist. She saw the truth of her words hit him. He had spent a lifetime building walls to keep danger out, only to realize he had also built a prison for his son. He asks for you, Luca said, and the raw honesty in his voice was more disarming than any display of power. I ask for you. The admission hung between them, vast and complicated. It wasn't a declaration of love, but something perhaps more profound for a man like him, an acknowledgement of need. She had become his compass when he was lost, the keeper of his wife's final testament, and the savior of his son's spirit. Isabella felt a pull, a dangerous and seductive current tempting her to stay, to become part of this dark, beautiful tapestry. But she knew herself. To stay would be to slowly become part of the machinery, to have her compassion worn down by the grim necessities of his world. She would start making excuses, making compromises. She would become another ghost in the machine. "I'm not part of this world," she said, her decision final. "But I can be a friend. To both of you. On my own terms." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper. It was not the old order pad from the diner, but a crisp, new sheet. On it she had written a single handwritten number. "This is my new number. My new life." She held it out to him. "Tell Leo he can call me anytime. About his models, his lessons, a bad dream, a good grade. Tell him I'll always answer." Luca looked at the paper as if it were a relic. It was worth more to him than any ledger. It was a thread, spun from trust and something resembling respect, connecting his fractured world to the one outside. He took it, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting moment, a connection as electric as it was brief. "The debt I owe you," he began, his voice gruff. "Is paid," she interrupted gently. "By letting me go." He nodded, a man of violence understanding the terms of a truce more easily than the terms of gratitude. He folded the paper and placed it carefully in his breast pocket, directly over his heart. "Then it is paid." The city air, even tinged with exhaust and the distant wail of a siren, tasted of freedom. Isabella walked down a busy street, her suitcase rolling behind her. She had a new apartment in a building with thin walls and noisy neighbors, a place that was vibrantly, messily alive. She had a new start, funded by the hazard pay Luca had insisted was non-negotiable. It wasn't a salary anymore, it was restitution, and she accepted it as such. She was free. But she was not the same woman who had served star pancakes in a dead-end diner. She had seen the abyss, and a part of it would always be with her, a cold, knowing stillness behind her eyes. She had looked into the heart of a ruthless man and found, not a monster but a flawed, grieving human. She had held a terrified boy and promised him safety, a promise she had kept in ways she never could have imagined. Her phone, a new, simple model, buzzed in her pocket. A smile, the first truly easy one in weeks, touched her lips as she answered. She didn't need to check the screen. "Hey Leo," she said, her voice warm, folding herself into the stream of pedestrians. "How was your day?" She listened, laughing at something he said about his history teacher, her voice a thread of normalcy woven through the extraordinary tapestry of her life. She continued walking, a solitary figure seamlessly blending back into the world, just as she'd wanted. But as she walked, she knew the truth. She was not just Isabella, the waitress. She was Isabella, the keeper of secrets, the friend to a boy who would one day inherit a kingdom of shadows, and the woman to whom the wolf himself owed a debt that could never truly be settled. She had left the fortress, but its echoes walked with her, a part of her story now, a quiet, powerful hum beneath the rhythm of her new, chosen life.